Morgan Freeman tested a rude cafe manager. What happened next shocked everyone. The elderly man sat alone in the corner, his clothes worn, his hands trembling as he counted the few coins in his pocket. Customers whispered. The staff ignored him. No one knew who he was. No one cared. Until a deep, unmistakable voice filled the room. Everything changed. Does kindness define true greatness? Comment 1. Or is status all that matters? Comment 0. The cafe bustled with the usual morning rush, chattering voices, the hiss of espresso machines, the clinking of cups. But in the midst of it all, he sat alone. An old man dressed in a faded coat, his hands rough with age. He hesitated at the counter, staring at the menu with a furrowed brow. The cashier sighed impatiently. "Sir, are you ordering or not?" A few customers nearby exchanged glances. One woman muttered, "Why is he even here?" He fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a handful of crumpled bills and loose coins. The manager stepped in, his voice low but firm. "We have a policy, sir. If you can't afford something, I'll have to ask you to leave." A hush fell over the cafe. The old man's fingers trembled as he tried to gather his coins. His lips parted, but no words came. Then, a deep, commanding voice cut through the silence. "That won't be necessary." The entire room froze. Every head turned toward the man who had spoken. A man no one had noticed walking in. A man everyone knew. Morgan Freeman. His gaze locked onto the manager, his expression unreadable. "You were saying?" The cafe, once filled with idle conversation and the rhythmic clatter of cups, had fallen completely silent. All eyes were now on the man who had spoken. Morgan Freeman. The staff behind the counter stiffened. The customers, who had barely spared a glance at the elderly man before, suddenly sat up straighter. Even the manager, who just moments ago had been so quick to dismiss the old man, now looked uneasy. The weight of Freeman's presence was undeniable. But Morgan? He wasn't here to bask in recognition. He was here for an explanation. Morgan stepped forward, his gaze locked onto the manager. "You were saying?" The man's confidence faltered. "Mr. Freeman, I didn't realize..." "Didn't realize what?" Morgan's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it. The manager swallowed hard. I just meant that we have certain policies." Morgan tilted his head slightly. "Policies?" The elderly man still stood at the counter, his fingers twitching as he clutched his coins. Morgan glanced at him, then back at the manager. "So tell me, what policy justifies humiliating a man for wanting a cup of coffee?" The manager's mouth opened and closed, searching for a response. But there wasn't one, because no excuse could justify what had just happened. And now, everyone in the cafe could see it. The cashier, still frozen in place, dared to glance at the old man. His frail hands were still shaking. His dignity had already been bruised. And that didn't sit right with Morgan. He took a step closer, reaching into his own pocket and pulling out his wallet. He placed a crisp bill on the counter. "Give the gentleman whatever he wants. On me." The old man looked up, his eyes widening. "Sir, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Morgan interrupted, his voice softer now. "But I want to." The man swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. "Thank you, but it's not just about the money." Morgan nodded. "I know. Because this wasn't about charity, it was about respect. And respect shouldn't come with a price tag." As the transaction was completed, the cafe patrons began to whisper. People who had pretended not to see the old man before were now whispering about what they had just witnessed. "Did you see how they treated him before Freeman stepped in?" "Yeah, but why is Freeman even here?" "That manager's done for." Morgan ignored the murmurs. He turned back to the elderly man. "Do you mind if I join you?" The man hesitated, then gave a small nod. Morgan picked up both coffees and guided him to an empty table by the window. The room buzzed with curiosity. No one had cared about the old man minutes ago. But now they all wanted to know who he was. Morgan stirred his coffee, watching the man across from him. What's your name? The man exhaled slowly as if weighing whether or not he wanted to share. John, he finally said. Nice to meet you, John. Do you come here often? John let out a small, dry chuckle. Not anymore. Used to. A long time ago. Morgan raised an eyebrow. What changed? John's eyes flickered to the counter, to the manager, then back to his cup. People stopped seeing me. Morgan's grip on his mug tightened slightly, because he understood exactly what John meant. Aging had a way of making you invisible, and society had a way of discarding those who no longer fit the mold of important. John continued. I used to run a business not far from here, a little bookstore. I knew half the folks in this neighborhood used to come in, chat, have coffee, talk about life. He paused, his expression unreadable. Then my health declined, closed the store, lost my footing a little, and people forgot. Morgan nodded slowly. Not everyone forgot. John looked up, puzzled. What do you mean? Morgan leaned in slightly, his voice carrying a quiet intensity. Because I remember you, John. John froze. Morgan saw the shock flash across his face, the way his fingers tightened around his cup. The cafe remained silent. Only the hum of the espresso machines and distant conversations filled the background. You do? John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Morgan smiled, nodding once. And I think it's time everyone else does too. The cafe had ignored John for too long. But now the whole room was about to learn exactly who he was and why he mattered. John sat motionless, his fingers wrapped tightly around the warm coffee cup. His eyes searched Morgan's face, confusion flickering in his gaze. You remember me? He asked hesitantly, as if the very idea was impossible. Morgan nodded, a small, knowing smile forming on his lips. I do, John, and I think it's time the rest of them do too. Around them, the cafe had quieted, but the weight of curiosity hung in the air. Employees who had once ignored John now stole cautious glances. Customers who had dismissed him as just another old man now leaned in, listening. And the manager? The manager stood frozen behind the counter, shifting uneasily, as if he knew something was about to unfold that he couldn't control. John let out a slow breath, his mind working through memories that had long been buried under the weight of loneliness and time. But how? He finally asked. Morgan took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle in before answering. Many years ago, when I was just starting out in my career, I used to visit a small bookstore after auditions. It was a place of comfort, of escape. The man who owned it always had the best book recommendations, and he never judged me when I was struggling to pay for a paperback. John's brows furrowed. Morgan continued, his voice rich with nostalgia. He always said, the right book finds you at the right time. That man was you, John. The cafe was so silent you could hear a pin drop. John's lips parted, his hands gripping the edge of the table. You were the young man always reading scripts in the corner. Morgan chuckled softly. That was me. John blinked rapidly, his throat bobbing as he swallowed down a wave of emotion. But that was decades ago. It doesn't matter how long it's been, John, Morgan said firmly. I never forgot what you did for me. You treated me with kindness when I was just another struggling actor. And now, I see how this place has treated you today. It's not right. John looked down, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. I didn't expect anyone to remember me. People, they move on. Morgan's gaze hardened. They shouldn't have. The whispers in the cafe had turned into stunned silence. The customers who had sneered at John now looked away, ashamed. The employees who had ignored him shifted in place, regret written all over their faces. And the manager? The manager cleared his throat, stepping forward in a desperate attempt to salvage the moment. Mr. Freeman, I assure you we had no idea. Morgan's head snapped toward him, his eyes piercing. No idea what? That you were treating a man with disrespect just because you didn't recognize him? The manager's face paled. I was just following company policy. Morgan held up a hand, cutting him off. Let me tell you something about policy. Respect should not be optional. Kindness should not be a privilege for the wealthy. And no one should have to prove their worth just to be treated like a human being. A ripple of quiet agreement passed through the cafe. Customers nodded. Some employees looked down, ashamed. And John? For the first time in a long time, he sat up a little straighter. Morgan turned back to John, his voice softening. This place forgot who you are, but I didn't, and I won't let them. John chuckled, though his eyes shone with unshed tears. I didn't think I'd ever be important again. Morgan shook his head. John, you were never unimportant. The world just got too busy to notice. John let out a shaky breath. I don't know what to say. Morgan smiled. Then don't say anything. Just drink your coffee. The cafe remained silent as John lifted his cup, taking a slow, deliberate sip. This time, it didn't taste bitter. It tasted like recognition, like dignity, like being seen. And then, Morgan placed his own coffee down and turned back to the manager. I think we need to have a conversation about how things are run around here. The cafe remained eerily quiet. No clinking cups, no idle chatter. Just the weight of embarrassment, shame, and realization pressing down on everyone in the room. Morgan Freeman turned his full attention to the manager, his gaze steady and unwavering. Tell me something, he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. If I hadn't walked in today, would this man still be sitting here ignored? The manager, Carl, shifted uncomfortably. Sir, Answer the question. Carl swallowed hard, glancing around as if searching for an escape, but there was none. Every employee, every customer, all eyes were on him. He exhaled sharply, lowering his gaze. Yes, he admitted. Morgan nodded slowly. That's what I thought. Morgan took a deep breath, surveying the cafe around him. I built my career on storytelling, he began, his voice commanding yet warm. But today I don't need a script to tell you the truth. The employees straightened, the customers leaned in. What I saw here today isn't just about one man being ignored, it's about a culture that decides who deserves kindness and who doesn't based on appearances. His words hung in the air. No one dared to look at John, but they all felt the weight of their silence from earlier. And let me tell you something, Morgan continued. That's not just wrong, that's unacceptable. Carl cleared his throat, his fingers twitching by his side. Sir, with all due respect, we run a business here. We have to cater to the right clientele. Morgan's eyebrows lifted. The right clientele? Carl hesitated. People who can afford it. A few customers winced. Someone muttered, "Wow," under their breath. Morgan leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. Let me ask you something, Carl. What exactly makes a person worth good service? Is it their clothes, their watch, the way they carry themselves? Carl opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing that any answer he gave would damn him further. I'll tell you what makes someone worth respect, Morgan continued. The fact that they are a person, that's it. That's all. And if that's something you need to be reminded of, then maybe you shouldn't be managing people at all. The silence in the room was deafening. Carl stiffened, his face pale. Are you firing me? Morgan studied him for a long moment. No, he finally said. Carl exhaled in relief. Too soon. I'm giving you a choice. Carl frowned. A choice? Yes. You can walk out of here right now jobless, or you can stay, but only if you're willing to change. Carl hesitated. Morgan leaned in. Because let me be clear, this isn't just about you. This is about every employee who follows your lead, every customer who watches how you treat others. If you want to prove that you deserve to be here, then you need to start by doing better. The cafe held its breath. Carl clenched his fists at his sides. Then, finally, I want to do better. A murmur spread across the cafe. Morgan gave a small nod. Then, show me. The tension in the air began to ease. Morgan turned to the employees. From this moment forward, this cafe is not just a place for business. It's a place where everyone is treated with dignity. That includes customers. That includes staff. That includes the people you might otherwise ignore. His gaze landed on John, who sat watching in awe. No more looking through people. No more treating kindness like it's something that has to be earned. A few employees nodded hesitantly. Samantha, the waitress who had first helped John, wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward. I think we can all do better, she said. Carl nodded reluctantly. Yeah, we can. Morgan let out a small, satisfied breath. Good, then let's start now. Morgan pulled out his wallet again. He slid a $100 bill across the table to John. John's eyes widened. Morgan, I can't. Yes, you can, Morgan interrupted, but not for yourself. John hesitated. Morgan smiled. Buy someone else a coffee, someone who needs it. John exhaled a slow, meaningful breath. Then with a small nod, he took the bill and slipped it into his pocket. He had been invisible when he walked in. Now he wasn't just seen, he was valued. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he mattered. Morgan stood up, dusting off his coat. I'll be back, he told Carl. Carl nodded stiffly. I'll be ready. The cafe was different now, not just in policy, not just in rules, but in heart. Morgan turned toward the door, but before he stepped out, he glanced back at John. See you next time? John smiled. Yeah, next time. But was Carl truly ready to change? That, only time would tell. The cafe was different now, at least it was supposed to be. Morgan Freeman had left behind a challenge, not just a lesson. And for the first few days, the change was noticeable. Employees were more attentive. Customers felt the shift in energy. Even Carl, the once dominant and dismissive manager, seemed to be making an effort. But Morgan knew better than anyone. Words meant nothing without action. And real change, it would take more than just a few days of good behavior. It would take a test, one that no one saw coming. Carl had never felt more watched in his life. Every move he made, every decision, all of it was under scrutiny. The employees no longer feared him, but they didn't trust him yet either. And the customers. Some still remembered how he had treated John, and their wary stares felt like knives in his back. He hated it. But more than that, he hated that a part of him knew he had earned this treatment, that he had been wrong. Still, he was trying. Even if it felt like trying wasn't enough. One evening, just before closing, a young woman entered the cafe. Her clothes were worn, her hair slightly disheveled, a sharp contrast to the usual clientele. She clutched her bag to her chest, scanning the room with uncertainty before approaching the counter. Carl was the only one working up front at that moment. He inhaled sharply. This was it, his moment to prove that he was not the same man Morgan had called out. "Welcome to Café Bell," Carl said, forcing himself to sound warm. "What can I get for you?" The woman hesitated, biting her lip. Just a coffee, please." Carl nodded. "That'll be $3.50. The woman reached into her bag, fingers trembling slightly, as she counted out small crumpled bills and loose coins. Carl's stomach tightened. He knew this moment. This was exactly the kind of situation where in the past he would have dismissed someone like her, would have assumed she wasn't worth the trouble, would have ignored her dignity. But now he had a choice. Carl cleared his throat. "It's okay," he said, sliding the coins back toward her. "This one's on the house." The woman's eyes widened. "Wait, what?" "It's on the house," Carl repeated. "Just enjoy your coffee." The woman hesitated. She was used to people turning her away, used to being treated as a burden. But today, someone was showing her kindness. She blinked rapidly, her lips parting, but no words came out. Then finally, she whispered, "Thank you." Carl nodded, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Pride, not in power, not in authority, but in choosing to do the right thing. Just as the woman took her coffee and sat down, the cafe door opened again. A familiar figure stepped inside. Morgan Freeman. His presence was as commanding as ever, but this time Carl wasn't afraid. Morgan's gaze swept over the cafe, landing on Carl. "How's it going?" Morgan asked. Carl exhaled slowly. "Different," he admitted. "Good different?" Carl thought about it for a moment. Then, to his own surprise, he nodded. "Yeah, good different." Morgan smiled slightly. "Good. But tell me, how do you think you did?" Carl hesitated. His eyes flickered to the woman, still sipping her coffee, unaware of what was happening. He could have turned her away. He didn't.